This video will review over chemical equivalents and how to calculate mass equivalents of acids and mass equivalents of bases. Many times chemists will find it more convenient to use equivalents instead of moles to quantify the amount of a substance. Now, the purpose for using equivalents instead of moles is that equivalents are defined so that one equivalent of any acid will react with one equivalent of any base. So with regard to acids, an acid equivalent is defined as the amount of acid that will donate 1 mole of hydrogen ions in a reaction with bases. The number of equivalents of an acid can be determined from its chemical formula. In other words, how many hydrogens are present. So let's look at some examples. HCl has only one acidic hydrogen, so that 1 mole of HCl is equal to 1 equivalent of HCl, since 1 mole of HCl can give up 1 H ion. H2SO4 has 2 acidic hydrogens because it's H2SO4. Thus 1 mole of H2SO4 donates 2 moles of hydrogen and contains 2 equivalents of H2SO4. Base equivalence deals with hydroxide base, and it is defined as the amount of base that will react with 1 mole of hydrogen ions. Since 1 mole of hydroxide ions reacts with 1 mole of hydrogen ions, the number of equivalents of a hydroxide base is 1 mole of the hydroxide base that equals the number of hydroxide ions in the chemical formula. In English, if we were to look at an example of NaOH, it would have 1 equivalent of hydroxide, while CaOH2 would have 2 equivalents of hydroxide. Therefore, we can see that NaOH has 1 OH, so 1 mole of NaOH would have 1 equivalent. CaOH2, 1 mole, would have 2 equivalents because of the 2. AlOH3, 1 mole, would have 3 equivalents because of the 3. With that said, we can now look at equivalent weights. 1 mole of a substance is defined as the weight in grams that is equal to its molecular weight. So 1 equivalent of a substance is the weight in grams equal to its equivalent weight. Let's use our previous acids to look at equivalent weight. For HCl, 1 mole of HCl equals 1 equivalent since 1 hydrogen is present. The molecular weight of HCl from the periodic table is 36.46. The equivalent weight of HCl would be 36.46. For H2SO4, 1 mole of H2SO4 equals 2 equivalents of H2SO4 since 2 hydrogens are present in the formula. The molecular weight of H2SO4 from the periodic table is 98.08. The equivalent weight of H2SO4 would be 98.08 divided by 2, thus 49.04. The 2 comes from our number of equivalents. So let's look at H3PO4. 1 mole of H3PO4 equals 3 equivalents of H3PO4. The molecular weight from the periodic table is 98. The equivalent weight would be the 98 divided by 3 from the equivalents, and therefore would be 32.66. Let's look at problems involving equivalents, weights, and equivalent weights. Now these are very similar to those for moles. there is a mathematical formula. That mathematical formula is the number of equivalents equals the weight in grams divided by the equivalent weight. Now let's see how we can apply that formula to an example problem. The example problem we will solve is for us to calculate the number of equivalents of calcium hydroxide in 6.32 grams of calcium hydroxide. The first thing we need to do is to calculate the equivalent weight of calcium hydroxide. We will determine the weight from the periodic table of calcium hydroxide. Now that's going to be 1 calcium, 2 oxygens, 2 hydrogens. The weight from the periodic table is 74.09. We have 2 hydroxides present, therefore we divide the 74.9 by 2, and we have an equivalent weight of calcium hydroxide as 37.05. Now that we have calculated the equivalent weight of calcium hydroxide, we can use the formula number of equivalents of calcium hydroxide equals the weight in grams of calcium hydroxide divided by the equivalent weight of calcium hydroxide. Our problem stated that the weight in grams was 63.2 grams of calcium hydroxide. We had our 37.05 grams of calcium hydroxide per equivalent of calcium hydroxide. We do the math and we get 0.171 equivalents. Now a second way we could look at setting that problem up was using our stoichiometry and canceling out our units. We had our 6.32 grams of calcium hydroxide, and we had 1 equivalent of calcium hydroxide equals 37.05 grams. The grams of calcium hydroxide cancel out, and we get 0.171 equivalents of calcium hydroxide. You may use either approach to solving your problems. Just select the one that is easiest for you. Let's look at one final example using dimensional analysis approach to solving the problem. The question says, determine the mass of one equivalent of AlOH3. So we have 1 mole of AlOH3. We know that 1 mole of AlOH3 weighs 78 grams from the periodic table. So this is the mass from the periodic table. Moles of AlOH3 cancel out. Now we also know that AlOH3 has 3 OHs, so 1 mole has 3 of these. We do our math, and so we would have 26 grams of aluminum hydroxide per mole of hydroxide.